Hello and welcome. I'm Jim Falk, and I'm so glad you could join us today. While the nation's attention did not turn to the demonstrations and encampments until this past April, the protest and counter-protests actually began shortly after Hamas's brutal attack on Israel on October 7th of last year. We're going to be joined by two rising sophomores whose views on the Hamas attack and Israel's response are really as distant as their two universities, Yale and the University of California at Berkeley. I'd like to welcome Corinne to the program. She's a rising sophomore at UC Berkeley studying computer science. She's an undergraduate organizer with graduate students for Justice in Palestine. Zachary Suri is a rising sophomore at Yale University, where he studies history and Jewish studies. He's an associate editor of Shibboleth, that's Yale's Jewish Studies Journal. And he's also the co-host of a great podcast, This is Democracy. Welcome, and thank you so much for being with us. You know, I was really excited about this program because both of you are really living the experience of what's happening on your campuses. Corinne, tell us what was your role, what has been your role, what will be your role at UC Berkeley?
I was a part of the encampment at UC Berkeley. It was a 22-day-long encampment. I participated in programming there. And then I was also part of a demonstration that lasted for about 10 weeks. That was a Sather Gate blockade. And that was bringing attention to the ongoing genocide that's occurring in Palestine, bringing attention to the number of martyrs. We're at about 36,000 reported, and that number is still rising. And that was just bringing attention to what's been going on in Palestine for the last couple of months.
Who organized these encampments? Was it really structured?
So the people who organized the encampment was the UC Berkeley Divestment Coalition. It's called UC Berkeley BDS. And it's a group of 75 plus orgs, all student organizations on campus. It includes Queers for Palestine. It includes Koreans for Decolonization. It includes Jewish Voice for Peace. It includes Graduate Students for Justice in Palestine. And they're all a diverse group of orgs that are working together on BDS issues at Berkeley campus.
Zachary, tell us about your experience at Yale.
Well, we were still reeling from the attack on October 7th. On October 9th or 10th, when I was woken up from my sort of Saturday, I think it was Saturday morning, sleep to a bunch of screaming. And I went down onto the quad. I walked across campus, and there was a huge protest of people, students and non-students, shouting, "Intifada, Intifada," resistance by any means necessary, from the river to the sea, etc. This was before any major Israeli response to the attack. And I have to say, I almost broke down in tears. It was so disturbing to see that the response to the worst violence against Jews since the Holocaust on my campus was this. And that was terrifying, I have to say. And in a way that I had never felt before, it made me question my place on campus. And I found the rhetoric just absolutely horrifying. And then in the next week, we organized a vigil for those killed on October 7th, which I attended. And then there was a vigil organized by some students advocating for Palestinians, for Palestinian lives, which I also attended, and a number of my friends from the Jewish community attended as well. And I have to say, as difficult as it was to have those conversations, I think to a certain extent they were happening before this April, and there were certain spaces where they were occurring, and they were not occurring in the usual channels, but they were occurring.
What do you mean by that when you say usual channels?
What I mean is that we as the Jewish community tried to reach out repeatedly to Muslim students organizations and to those among our own community who felt very strongly about the conflict. And we had a number of conversations on that front, but there was also, we kept sort of running into a brick wall in the sense that there was a sort of refusal to engage at an organizational level with a Jewish community that has a lot of connections to Israel for obvious reasons. We have a lot of Israeli students. We have a lot of exchange programs with Israel, with the country in which half of the Jewish people live. And so a lot of those sort of typical organizational channels were sort of missing, even right after October 7th, I think. But the university, I will say, responded very well. Our president, who is also Jewish, he responded by condemning the attack on October 7th. And we had a very sort of constructive conversation, I think, in the weeks following that initial protest that horrified so many of us. And that seemed like an explicit justification of what happened on October 7th.
Zachary's been talking about seeking to have conversation with those in support of Palestine. What type of communication has your group had with some of the counter-protesters, and has that been successful?
I'm speaking for me personally. I've had some negative experiences with counter-protesters. I've had Zionists come up to me and tell me that just because I'm queer, I can't support the Palestinian people. I've had people yelling slurs in my face because of who I support. I've also had a lot of Jewish comrades who support Palestine have been yelled very anti-Semitic things by other Jewish people. They've been called capos, they've been called fake Jews, they've been called so many different slurs because of who they support. And that's been really disheartening for me to see. And this has been coming from others. Counter-protesters, this has been coming from professors on campus. They're not allowed in Hillel. They're not allowed in many Jewish organizations where they would hope to find community and safe spaces. But unfortunately, they're unable to because they support the Palestinian people and because they support the Palestinian cause.
I think that what I've experienced has been the exact opposite, on my campus at least, that Hillel has been a place where these conversations occur, where all Jewish students are welcome. Obviously, they're not allowed to sort of organize at Hillel, and they're not allowed to sort of hold protests at Hillel, but we're able to have these conversations, and we have conversations between people who disagree tremendously on this issue. I will say on the question of the role of the Jewish community, I think that we can be very clear that like anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are not the same thing. But I do think it's very important to recognize as well that when you hate people just for being Zionists, and when you hate people for being Israeli or from Israel, then that is anti-Semitism.
So one thing that I really want to get a handle on is Corinne, what are the demands? What are you seeking to achieve, I guess, first from the university and then second in a wider manner?
So the UC Berkeley BDS Coalition has four main demands. The first is end the silence. So that's ending the silence from administration. They have not spoken much to like the Palestinian struggle, the ongoing genocide that is occurring, and the mass destruction of the Gaza Strip. We had some like leeway with that when we had Chancellor Christ spoke a little bit about graduation, and she released a statement from her office, but we're still kind of seeing the impacts of that. The second is end the repression. So this is ending the repression against students who are speaking out. We have many students who have faced repression in their classes. We have graduate students, instructors who are unable to teach or unable to speak their mind in their classes. Even if they're allowed to speak on other current issues, they're not allowed to speak about Palestine. The third is academic boycott. So this is boycotting universities in Israel, specifically like Tel Aviv University, universities where you're seeing apartheid systems, where Palestinian students, if they were to study abroad, they would be unable to attend these universities in the same way that their Israeli counterparts would. And then the fourth is divestment. This is divesting from organizations and companies that are complicit in the genocide. And this is following the BDS framework.
In the context of Yale's investments, at least, the only evidence that protesters have that Yale is even sort of invested in weapons manufacturers at all is that Yale is invested in index funds, which invest among many other companies in companies like Boeing or Lockheed Martin, who I will also note provide all of the weapons that defend us as Americans, but that we're also supplying to our allies around the world. I think one thing,
and also civil aviation and satellites and GPS and much more.
Yeah.
So yesterday, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think to divest from all of these companies, or to divest from Israel, is to, one, divest from Jews in Israel, I think, which is deeply problematic, but also to divest from democracy, because these are the weapons that we are using as Americans to supply our allies around the world and to defend ourselves. Again,
Corinne, one thing I want to ask you is, academic exchanges for students and for professors, it seems to me to be extremely important, especially when often governments cannot talk with each other. So I want to be clear, are you advocating a cessation of all exchanges with Israel?
We're advocating for a cessation of all exchanges that if a student was unable to attend that same university, if a Palestinian student is unable to attend that same university, that exchange should not be allowed.
How do we set this up so that you can have the legitimate right to protest, which is certainly permitted and encouraged under our First Amendment, but not disrupting the normal operation of a university?
I mean, the point of protest is to disrupt your daily life. The point of protests, this is why we continued for as long as we could, was to disrupt your daily life, to make sure that you understand the cause that we're advocating for, to make sure that our Palestinian voices are heard. And that is why it's disrupting. And that's why it's continued for so long.
Last February, again, on or near your campus, there was a reservist from the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, who was scheduled to speak, I believe, in a campus facility. And there was a lot of demonstrations that made that impossible, and they had to bring in additional security. Again, where do you stand on free speech to allow people from all sides to speak, especially at your wonderful, esteemed university, which has such a remarkable tradition of free speech?
I don't believe that someone who's a murderer, someone that has advocated for the killing of all Palestinians, who has said that he does not differentiate between a terror cell and a kindergarten, should be able to speak on campus.
Zachary, what is it like at Yale now about this?
I think that, as you said, I think it's important for us to support and affirm every student's right to protest and to free speech. But free speech does not mean that you have the right to disrupt campus completely, to block parts of campus, which happened at Yale. They blocked the main quad with their tents. And it does not mean that one has a right to limit others' free speech. So the second encampment at Yale, which blocked cross campus, which is the sort of main quad and thoroughfare on Yale's campus, they were asking people who wanted to cross through to the library or to the Jewish community center, to Hillel. They were asking them to agree to support Palestinian liberation, or they wouldn't be allowed through the encampment, or they would be escorted through the encampment. It was incredibly absurd, I found, and this was also in the middle of Passover, and a number of my friends who were also visibly Jewish, they were trying to cross through the encampment, and they were inexplicably asked to take all of their shoes off before crossing part of the green. And to be clear, they were not grandstanding or anything. They were just trying to get through to our Jewish Life Center, and they were asked to take their shoes off. And they were also asked if they would be escorted through the quad. And from my perspective, this clearly crosses a line, and it's a violation of others' free speech to continue to disrupt our expression, but also to disrupt basic activities on campus until people sort of agree with your position.
Corinne, what do you think is the appropriate reaction of the university? There's different levels. Do you think that there should be allowing everybody to do whatever, including vandalism, which has happened across the country? Or should there be suspension, expulsion? What should be the appropriate reaction of the universities?
I think sitting down for negotiations and hearing the pain and suffering that Palestinian students have been going through. I've been watching their families. So many members of their families have been killed, and listening to their voices, listening to their perspectives, and understanding why they're advocating for what they're advocating for. I think that's really important. Yeah, I think that's an appropriate response, is listening. If we're such advocates for free speech, if we're saying that everyone should have their position and their opinion, then we should listen and we should learn from them and we should have these conversations.
Go ahead, Zachary. What do you think the appropriate reaction should be? Because I saw even at Harvard, several students, unfortunately, were not able to go through their commencement and get their degrees. And there's a lot of discussion about how this should be handled by different university administrators.
I think arrest should clearly be the last resort. But I do think if protesters refuse to move, and as at Yale, if they refuse to actually engage in those conversations, or if, as at Columbia, they occupy buildings and they sort of violently exclude others from certain parts of campus, I do think that arrest should be used. I do think also that, as I said, it should be the last resort, and that academic penalties should come first. But I do think that it's critical that to create a sort of actual environment of free speech on campus where people can exchange ideas and have constructive conversations with people they disagree with, then you need to remove encampments that intentionally exclude others. I personally, with some friends, tried to engage with those in the encampment, and they refused to acknowledge any Jewish pain on campus. And there was an explicit acknowledgement that the encampments were not for conversation. What we were told is these are not for conversation; they are for confrontation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a quotation. And I think that is exactly the kind of protest that is inappropriate on a college campus, because it restricts conversation and it restricts free speech. And if necessary, arrest should be used to prevent that.
Well, as our viewers can tell, I'm a bit older than you guys, and I'd like to be positive. Both of you have studied this issue, and you know it well. The Palestinian-Israeli conflict has been going on for a very, very long time. Corinne, how do you see a path to peace?
I see a path to peace through the BDS framework. It's the returning of lands, the way that dispossessed Palestinians are able to return to their homelands, to have the same rights as their Israeli
Let me stop you
counterparts.
there. How do you define as the land?
The lands and the villages that they were removed from 77 years ago.
Do either one of you see a path for a two-state solution, which has been on the table for 3-4 decades?
I do. I think that this moment, as tragic as it is, can be, with the right incentives, can be a moment in which we achieve a lasting peace. I think that the Biden administration's tactics have been spot on in this, pressuring Israel to accept a two-state solution, pressuring the Palestinians as well to accept a two-state solution. I think the reality is that this conflict has shown that the only way forward is a two-state solution. We can't continue to sort of fight with history. We have to look at the future. And the only viable future that I think any sort of reasonable observer can see is a two-state solution, where Palestinians have a state, they have political rights, they have sovereignty, and Jews living in the land of Israel have sovereignty within their borders as well. I think that's the only way forward.
You know, right now, I guess there's 3 or 4 countries that have recognized Palestine, Ireland, Spain, Norway, 3 that come quickly to mind. But no one, Corinne, has said that the land should be entirely given back to the Palestinians. So I'm looking for you to tell me about a diplomatic solution.
I think we're looking for, there's so many families who still hold keys to their family homes. There's so many, I know so many Palestinian students on campus who have been unable to return to their family homes that they've been able to visit, but they're unable to live in the houses that their families have been from. And I think that's a really important thing to recognize, and to know that the trauma that they've faced because of that, because they've been unable to return, because their way of life has been shattered. And I think that's really important to recognize, is looking for that right of return. It's something that many organizations advocate for. It's Palestinian Youth Movement, Jewish Anti-Zionist Network. A lot of organizations do advocate for this right to return, because it's so important to heal that trauma, to heal what's been broken, because they've been unable to do that by the Israeli government.
Go ahead, Zachary.
I mean, I think that that is not a way forward. I think that the reality is that the borders that were proposed in 1947 to create peace in the region, created by the United Nations, were not accepted by Palestinians or by Israel's Arab neighbors. And that's exactly what led to this displacement. I mean, we can talk also about fringe Israeli and Arab groups that caused violence between the communities and displacement. But the reality is that this is the product of 75 odd years of war and of conflict. And the solution is not to try and remove all the Jews from the land that they've been living on for generations. The solution is to create a framework for peace that doesn't satisfy everyone, that doesn't allow everyone to live anywhere, but does create basic political sovereignty and opportunity for all. And I think that's the only way forward. And it's the only possible diplomatic path. And even, I think, the only possible path, period.
Zachary, you used a word a minute ago. I think you said it 2 or 3 times, and that was pressure. The U.S. should pressure. From my vantage point, I don't see us having as much leverage over Israel as we might like to have.
I understand what you're saying, but I don't actually think that's true. I think that the United States, as Israel's closest ally, and as the only real country in the world that hasn't sort of abandoned Israel in this fight to any extent, I think we have a lot of leverage over the Israelis. And I would say also, as an American Jewish community, I think what we should be doing, instead of sort of tokenizing ourselves and allowing ourselves to be a part of a movement that has all these sort of hateful elements, we should be advocating and expressing our support for conditioning aid to Israel in order to achieve a lasting peace. That's something that personally I feel very strongly about, that I think the Biden administration has been doing successfully but needs to do more of. And I think that if we were to start doing that, and if we as an American Jewish community were to be supportive of that, that could really create an opportunity for peace in the region. Now, there's another element to this, is that there has to be a sort of partner for peace on the Palestinian side as well. And this is partly why I find the recognition of a state of Palestine somewhat ridiculous in this moment. Is there is no state that exists. There is no sort of coherent political unit. And I think the task of those who care about the Palestinian people and those who care about the future of the region and about a future of peace is to create a lasting government order in Palestine that isn't terrorist like Hamas, and that can effectively represent the Palestinian people. And I've yet to see serious pressure in that direction.
So when you look at the Palestinian government organization, there really is not a whole lot of unity right now. Corinne, how do you see a strong Palestinian leader coming out of what we're looking at now, both in the West Bank and in Gaza?
I think it's hard to create a cohesive Palestinian government when we have calorie intake being limited by these Israelis, of the amount of food that is being allowed into Gaza before October 7th. People have described the Gaza Strip as an open-air prison because of the restriction of movement of Palestinians. And how can you have these exchanges? How can you have
I hate to interrupt, but there's one other question I got to get to, and we're running out of time, and that is on both sides, protesters, counter-protesters, however you define it. There's been discussion about how much funding support is coming from outside, beyond the university community. Zachary, what are you seeing at Yale?
I don't think that the protests are sort of fundamentally coming from outside. I do think they're coming from within the student body. And to me, that's even more disturbing, that students on campus are sort of willing to express these, I think, hateful and ignorant views regularly, or at least willing to tolerate and condone them in their fellow protesters. That I find very disturbing.
Corinne, what do you see? Where's your funding coming from? And is everyone from the university community?
I mean, we're all from the university community. We're all students. We're all graduate students, graduate student workers. We're all staff members. We're all faculty. And then we also encourage community members to come out and support us. But at the end of the day, we are the UC Berkeley community. And the funding that we're receiving is from the Bay Area community, from community members who care deeply about this about this issue. And it's important to realize that, like, we are fighting for Palestinian liberation. We are fighting for their humanity. We are fighting so that they do not have to see their siblings, their brothers and sisters
Right.
killed so violently.
I truly want to thank you both for expressing your positions very strongly and for being such outstanding students at two very well-regarded universities. So thank you so much for being guests on today's program. And as we've heard, the views expressed by these two young, actively involved students from great universities are markedly different, underscoring the challenge that has bedeviled the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians for decades, and I might even say, if not centuries. Our hope is that by more discussion and peaceful expressions of protest, there exists the possibility for empathy from both sides, however difficult that may be. I want to thank all of you for watching our program, where we talk about things that matter with people who care.